Our story takes place in a kingdom known for its grandeur and power, the mighty Persian Empire. A land filled with treasures, riches, and an endless supply of resources. Persia, ruled by the great King Xerxes, was one of the largest empires of the ancient world. Xerxes had everything that anyone could dream of: wealth, power, an army that stretched across many nations. His kingdom was vast, his influence unmatched. But there was something that even all his riches couldn't buy: companionship. Despite the vastness of his empire, King Xerxes was lonely. His heart was heavy after a disagreement with his queen, Vashti. You see, one day, King Xerxes asked Queen Vashti to appear before him and show off her beauty to his guests at a lavish banquet. But Queen Vashti, with a sense of dignity and independence, refused to obey his command. This disobedience angered the king. In his fury, he removed her from her position as queen and sought a new one. Now, with his heart broken and his pride wounded, King Xerxes decided to hold a contest to find a new queen. He ordered his officials to summon the most beautiful and noble young women from all across the kingdom to come to the palace. They would be pampered, prepared, and presented before the king, who would then choose one to become his queen. And this is where we meet Esther. Esther was not a woman of high rank. She was young, beautiful, but more importantly, she was of humble birth. Esther was a Jewish girl living in the capital city of Susa. She had lost both her parents at a young age and was raised by her older cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai loved Esther deeply, almost like a father, and treated her with care and respect. He taught her not only about the ways of the world, but also about their faith, their people, and their history as Jews. In the land of Persia, being Jewish wasn't always easy or welcomed, and Mordecai made sure Esther understood the importance of keeping their heritage private. Though she lived a quiet life, the beauty and grace that radiated from Esther couldn't be hidden. She had a presence about her, one that was captivating but also humble. Her heart was good, and she walked through life with a kindness that people couldn't help but notice. When the royal decree arrived, calling for young women to be brought to the palace for the king's contest, Esther had no choice but to obey. But there was one important thing that Mordecai, her father figure, told her. Do not tell anyone about your heritage. Keep it a secret, Esther. In a world where identity was often used against you, Mordecai knew that her heritage could put her in danger, especially since the Jews were often looked down upon in Persia. Esther listened carefully to Mordecai's advice and kept quiet about her Jewish background. It wasn't that she was ashamed of her faith, but rather, she knew that in the palace, it was better to keep this part of herself a secret, at least for now. Esther's entry into the contest wasn't just about being chosen because of her looks. The palace officials noticed something special about her. There was something about Esther, her demeanor, her gentleness, her grace, that stood out even among the other beautiful young women brought to the palace. The palace was a world of its own, and the preparations were unlike anything Esther had ever experienced. She was treated like royalty, given beauty treatments, special clothing, and the chance to meet the king. As the weeks passed, the other women in the palace could see that Esther wasn't just beautiful on the outside. Her inner strength and poise shone just as brightly. She didn't demand attention, it came to her naturally. And so, Esther stood among the many women, each hoping to be chosen as the next queen, but there was something different about her. It wasn't just her beauty, it was her heart. The day arrived when Esther, with grace and humility, was finally called to meet King Xerxes. The king, surrounded by the splendor of his court, sat upon his throne, awaiting the young women who would be presented to him. Esther stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The eyes of the king fell upon her, and in that moment, everything changed. Xerxes looked at her with deep interest. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him. It was her grace, her elegance, and her quiet strength. And so, after much consideration, King Xerxes chose Esther to be his queen. Her life, which had begun with so much sorrow, was about to take an incredible turn. From an orphaned Jewish girl to the queen of one of the greatest empires in the world, Esther was now in the royal palace, a woman of power and influence. But Esther's journey didn't stop there. It was only just beginning. Esther's rise to power may have seemed like a fairy tale, but the dangers of the royal court were far from over. Now that she was queen, Esther would soon find herself in the middle of a conspiracy that threatened not only her life but the lives of all the Jewish people. But little did she know, she was exactly where God wanted her to be, for such a time as this. Esther had gone from a quiet, humble girl to the queen of the Persian Empire. After her selection, life in the palace was nothing like the simple existence she had known. King Xerxes, pleased with his choice, showered Esther with attention and respect. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't just her appearance that captivated the king. It was her wisdom, her grace, and the kindness that shone through in everything she did. Though she was now in a place of power, Esther was still a Jewish woman. Her true identity remained a secret, as Mordecai had advised her. She knew that revealing her heritage could be dangerous, especially in a palace where political tensions ran high and loyalty to the king was everything. Esther's life in the palace was comfortable, but her heart was never fully at ease. She understood that things in the royal court were never as simple as they seemed, and danger could be lurking around any corner. But as Esther settled into her new life, a new character entered the scene, Haman. Haman was a high-ranking official, a trusted advisor to King Xerxes. He had power, wealth, and influence, but like many with power, his pride soon grew beyond measure. He believed that everyone in the kingdom should bow down to him and honor his position. He expected nothing less. One day, as Haman walked through the palace gates, he passed by Mordecai, who was sitting near the entrance. Haman, expecting to be bowed to as usual, was shocked when Mordecai did not rise. You see, Mordecai was a Jew, and he would bow to no one but God. This enraged Haman. How dare Mordecai defy him? How dare one man not show him the respect he believed he deserved? In his fury, Haman didn't stop at Mordecai's refusal. No, he decided that if one man dared to dishonor him, then all the Jews in the kingdom were guilty of the same offense. He began to plot a terrible act of vengeance. Haman convinced King Xerxes to issue a decree that would destroy all the Jews living in Persia. Haman painted the Jews as a people who lived differently, who followed different laws and customs. He told the king that they were a threat to the peace of the empire. He promised the king a large sum of money if the decree to destroy the Jews was signed. King Xerxes, trusting Haman's advice, gave his approval. A royal decree was sent out to every corner of the empire, and the date was set for the massacre. On this day, all Jews were to be killed. The news spread quickly, and panic swept over the Jewish community. The people were terrified. They had done nothing wrong, yet they were now being marked for destruction. In the city of Susa, where Esther and Mordecai lived, the streets were filled with grief. Mordecai, deeply distressed by the decree, tore his clothes and put on sackcloth, a traditional sign of mourning. When Esther learned of the king's decree, she was shocked, but she didn't know what to do. She had risen to the position of queen, but she was still just one woman in the midst of a vast empire. She had no direct way to change the king's mind. Then, Mordecai sent a message to Esther, urging her to do something. He told her that she couldn't sit idly by. He reminded her that even though she was queen, her position might be exactly why she had been placed in the palace. It was as if Mordecai was saying, "Esther, maybe you were chosen to be queen for this very moment. For this purpose. You have a responsibility to act." Mordecai's words were a wake-up call. For the first time, Esther realized that she had been placed in the palace not just for comfort or wealth, but for something much greater. "Who knows," Mordecai said, "but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Esther felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. The truth was clear. If she did nothing, the Jewish people, her people, would be destroyed. But if she went to the king and revealed her identity, she could risk everything, her life, her position, even the life of Mordecai. But Esther knew that sometimes you must take risks for what is right. She understood that God had placed her in this position for a purpose, and she had a responsibility to act. She made a decision. She would go to the king, even if it meant risking her life. Esther's heart raced with fear, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the moment that would define her life. Would she choose comfort and safety, or would she stand up for her people? Will her courage be enough to change the fate of her people? Let's see. Esther's heart was heavy with fear. She had spent days thinking about the decision she now faced. She was a queen, yes, but her position didn't guarantee safety. In the palace, a law had been established. No one could approach the king without being summoned. Anyone who dared to break that rule could be executed. No one, not even the queen, was exempt. Esther was afraid. Deeply afraid. She had lived a life of obedience and caution, and now she was about to take a step that could cost her everything. Yet, the more she thought about it, the more she knew she had no choice. The lives of her people, her family, her friends, her entire community, were on the line. Mordecai's message echoed in her mind. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Mordecai wasn't just reminding Esther of her position, he was reminding her of her purpose. She wasn't queen by accident. She wasn't in the palace by chance. This was all part of a bigger plan, a divine plan. Maybe, just maybe, she had been placed in this position for this exact moment. Esther knew that if she stayed silent, her people would perish. But if she acted, she might lose her life. What if I perish? Esther thought, her mind racing. And then, in a moment of deep resolve, she made her decision. She sent a message to Mordecai, if I perish, I perish. These were not words of recklessness but words of courage. Esther knew that doing what was right, following God's plan, was worth any risk. She couldn't sit idly by when so much was at stake. Before approaching the king, Esther decided to fast and pray. She knew that she could not do this alone. She needed God's help, guidance, and protection. She asked everyone in the Jewish community to do the same, to fast with her for 3 days and nights. It was a time of seeking God's will and trusting Him for the courage she would need to step into the king's presence. The day of reckoning arrived. Esther was prepared to risk everything, but she knew she was not alone. She had prayed, fasted, and trusted in God's timing. And now, she was ready. With courage in her heart and God by her side, she put on her royal robes, walked through the palace gates, and approached the king's throne. King Xerxes, seated on his throne, noticed Esther standing at the entrance. His eyes widened, but he saw something in her. Something different. Instead of reacting with anger or fear, as the law required, he extended his golden scepter toward her, signaling that she was not to be executed. She had his permission to speak. What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you. Esther, trembling but composed, stood before the king, knowing that this was her moment. The king's words were kind, but her request was anything but simple. Esther had to be careful. She didn't want to reveal Haman's plot just yet. She wanted to build trust with the king and give herself time to expose the truth in the right way. If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for them. It may have seemed like a small request, but Esther was carefully planning her next move. She invited King Xerxes and Haman to a private banquet, hoping that this setting would provide her with the opportunity to speak openly and reveal what was really happening. At the banquet, Esther did not immediately reveal Haman's evil plot. Instead, she carefully observed the king and Haman, all the while preparing for the right moment to act. The king, pleased with her hospitality and grace, asked again, "What is your request, Queen Esther? What do you want from me?" But Esther, in her wisdom, knew this was not the moment. She still needed more time, and she chose to be patient. Instead of speaking out immediately, she invited the king and Haman to another banquet the following day. "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to another banquet I will prepare for them tomorrow, and then I will answer the king's question." Why did Esther wait? Why didn't she just expose Haman right there and then? She could have, but she understood the power of patience and timing. She knew that revealing the truth at the right moment, when the king's heart was open, would be far more effective than rushing to make her case. Esther trusted God's timing and knew that He would guide her through this process, step by step. As the king and Haman left the banquet that evening, the tension began to grow. Esther had asked for just one more day, one more opportunity to act. But with each passing moment, The weight of what she was about to do grew heavier on her heart. Esther had done everything she could. Now, it was a matter of trusting God for the final steps. Would she be able to expose Haman's plan? Would her courage be enough to save her people? The next banquet would be the moment of truth. The moment of truth had arrived. Esther had carefully prepared for this day. The tension was thick in the air as King Xerxes and Haman arrived at the second banquet, just as Esther had requested. The king, curious and eager, asked once again, "What is your request, Queen Esther? What is it that you want from me?" Esther knew that the time to speak had come. She took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of courage she had. In front of the king and his highest advisor, Haman, she stood up, ready to reveal the truth that had been weighing heavily on her heart. "If I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and the lives of my people at my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept silent, for the affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. And then, with great courage, Esther revealed the shocking truth. The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. The king's face turned red with fury. How dare anyone plot against his queen? How dare anyone attempt to harm her and her people? His anger grew as he turned to Haman and demanded to know the full truth. Who dares to do such a thing? Who would harm my queen and her people? Esther, standing strong and resolute, pointed directly at Haman. "This man, Haman, has plotted to destroy us." The king's anger flared even more, and Haman's fate was sealed. King Xerxes, enraged by the betrayal, ordered that Haman be arrested. The very gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, the man who had refused to bow to him, were now to be used for Haman's own execution. The king commanded that Haman be hanged on those very gallows, and so it was done. Haman, the man who had plotted the destruction of the Jews, was brought to justice. But the story did not end with Haman's downfall. Because of Esther's bravery and the king's decision, Mordecai, who had been wronged by Haman, was honored in Haman's place. The king issued a decree that Mordecai was to be given Haman's position and authority, a fitting reward for Mordecai's faithfulness and courage. And then came the most wonderful part of all. The king's decree to destroy the Jews was reversed. With Haman's downfall, the threat to the Jewish people was lifted. A new decree was issued, allowing the Jews to defend themselves against anyone who would still try to harm them. The Jews, who had been trembling in fear, now stood tall, ready to protect their families and their lives. And when the appointed day came, they defeated their enemies, and the massacre that Haman had planned never took place. The Jewish people, saved from certain destruction, celebrated their victory with great joy and gratitude. They established a festival called Purim, a time of remembrance and thanksgiving for their deliverance. Every year, the Jews would gather together to remember how Esther's courage, Mordecai's wisdom, and God's faithfulness had saved them. They would celebrate with feasting, giving gifts, and helping the poor, always remembering the power of standing up for what is right, even in the face of fear. Esther's bravery had not only saved her people, but it had also helped establish a lasting legacy of faith. She had trusted in God's plan, even when it was difficult, and her courage had made all the difference. Esther's story teaches us so much about courage, faith, and obedience to God's plan. At the heart of her story is the message that sometimes, doing what is right requires us to step out in faith, even when it feels terrifying. Like Esther, we may not always know why we are in certain situations, but we can trust that God has a purpose for each of us.